Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to the terrifying Vaughn Lodge. It's really not all that terrifying, but there are some scary little furry creatures that live here that demand food and walks. So, in as far as that goes, it's kind of a scary place. But today we are talking about scary books. It is October, Halloween is coming up, and at this time of year, booktubers are all contractually obliged to talk about scary books. So here I am, fulfilling my obligation. Actually, the other day I saw a video from Steve Donoghue, who is famous for his starter kit videos. And he did a video on vampires. It was his vampire starter kit, and it was excellent. I mean, this was a great collection of books that he was talking about. Great list of books. But at the end of that video, he said he was thinking of doing a horror starter kit, that if any of us wanted to do one, go ahead. So here I am doing it. This is my horror starter kit. This is a list of 15 books that I think, if you're interested in the horror genre, read these books first. This is a great place to start with horror, these books. It is my horror starter kit. Some of these books are classics of the genre. Some of these books have been tremendously influential. Some of them are just really scary. So on with the list. This is not a list that is in order as far as how great they are. But definitely I had to start the starter kit with the most influential and important horror writer of all, Edgar Allan Poe. His stories of gothic, psychological, and supernatural horror have been immensely influential on all the horror that has followed. So we had to start with Edgar Allan Poe. Now, every publisher has their own classic edition of Edgar Allan Poe, their own essential volume of Edgar Allan Poe, and usually they all have the same stories in them. You will find The Telltale Heart. You will find The Pit and the Pendulum, The Fall of the House of Usher, The Murders in the Rue Morgue. All of his best stuff you will usually find in any of these publishers' Edgar Allan Poe volumes. So definitely start with Poe. Poe is the place to start with horror. Moving on, we've got another classic. We've got Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. The classic, beautifully written story of a crazed scientist who decides to make his own human being. And of course, it all goes horribly wrong. First of all, Dr. Frankenstein is the ultimate deadbeat dad. He created his creature and then immediately ran off and abandoned it just because it was, well, horrifying looking. It was a hideous creature, but so what? This poor guy, this poor creature, if Frankenstein had just spent some time with it and tried to teach it a few things, maybe it wouldn't have become a monster, but it was left all on its own to suffer from the hands of cruel human beings simply because he was, hideous. And so, yeah, he became a monster and was really pissed at Frankenstein. Justifiably so, I think. He went to extremes, this monster did, but, he's a monster. So, this book by Mary Shelley, which is about all sorts of things, it's one of those books that the more I read it, the more I get out of it. Every time I've read it, and I've read it several times, I found something new in this story. Excellent story. The story of Frankenstein and the monster of Frankenstein. It's not like any of those films you've seen. Even the film called Mary Shelley's Frankenstein wasn't Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Read the book. It's amazing. Moving on to another classic. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. This is the story, of course, of Dr. Jekyll, who creates a potion, a formula that can turn him into the naughty, naughty Mr. Hyde, which he wants to do. You know, we normally think of Dr. Jekyll being the good one, but he wants to become Mr. Hyde so he can do all the dastardly, naughty, scandalous stuff that he can't get away with being the proper Dr. Jekyll. So he's kind of a creep, Dr. Jekyll. And this is a really well-written story. Excellent piece of horror literature. It's kind of a werewolf story, but not really. You should definitely read this story. Again, tremendously influential and a classic of the genre. Moving on to probably the ultimate horror classic, Dracula by Bram Stoker. The ultimate monster story. The monster that towers above all other monsters because he's Dracula. This was the first adult book I read, Dracula, and it scared me to death as a little kid. I've enjoyed it every time I've read it since, and I've read it several times. Fantastic story, the story of Dracula. Great horror story. Again, tremendously influential. It's influenced everything in horror Dracula has. The story of Dracula, Count Dracula, the vampire, who goes to England from his castle in Transylvania to cause all kinds of trouble. Who knows, maybe he even wants to create an army of the undead. Who knows what this guy's going to be up to, but he's stopped by Dr. Van Helsing and his band of vampire hunters. Excellent book. You should read Dracula. It's amazing. Moving on, we're going to move on from vampires to ghosts. Ghosts and ghost stories, tremendously important in the history of horror. And the greatest practitioner of the classic ghost story is M.R. James. M.R. James and the collected ghost stories. His ghosts are dangerous. You don't want to mess with the ghosts in M.R. James stories, man. Dangerous, creepy, horrific. And unfortunately, if you're in an M.R. James story, you know, you could just be in the wrong place at the wrong time. You could pick up the wrong object. You can piss off the wrong person, and it's over. Yeah, he wrote some really scary, disturbing stories, M.R. James did, and his ghosts are ghosts not to mess with. Moving on to Arthur Mackin. Arthur Mackin and The Great God Pan and Other Horror Stories. This is published by Oxford. There are several Arthur Mackin collections out there. I think this is the best one because it has everything essential from his horror stories. This has, of course, The Great God Pan, one of the greatest horror stories of all time. Also has his creepy stories of the little people. And this also has his novel, The Three Impostors, which is an episodic novel. And the different episodes have often been cut out of the novel and published on their own as stories and anthologies. But it's good to read the whole thing. Definitely pick this up. Arthur Mackin is still read by horror writers today and is still influencing their work. He's essential. Arthur Mackin. Moving on to the most influential horror writer of the 20th century, certainly the most important, H.P. Lovecraft, and this collection from Penguin, The Call of Cthulhu and Other Weird Stories, edited by S.T. Joshi. This is a good place to start with Lovecraft. This volume has some of his best stories. It's an excellent place to start with Lovecraft. His stories are unique. He was a unique writer. He was influenced by a lot of different writers, but he would take those influences and make them into something uniquely his own. Lovecraft was amazing and wrote terrifying stories. He cannot be ignored. He is an essential part of the history of horror fiction. Moving on to another very important, influential writer. Later in the 20th century, we need to get to the best of Richard Matheson. Richard Matheson, great writer. Probably best known today for I Am Legend, his vampire novel, which was a science fiction and a horror novel, and The Shrinking Man, tremendously important science fiction novel, which was also horror. And he was, of course, the writer of many of the best episodes of The Twilight Zone. But his short fiction, I think, is the place to start with Richard Matheson. And this collection from Penguin is dynamite. So many of his great horror stories. Indeed, this is the best of Richard Matheson. This is where you want to start with this guy. If you are a reader of modern horror and you read this, you can see the influence that Richard Matheson has had on modern horror. It's easy to see. This guy was incredible. Richard Matheson. Read that book. Moving on to perhaps the essential haunted house novel, The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. Perhaps not the scariest haunted house story ever written, but tremendously important. Like I said, one of the most important haunted house stories, probably the most important haunted house story. A lot of the haunted house stories that came afterwards, yes, they're more frightening, yes, they're more intense, but there's something about this story. It's a psychological as well as a supernatural horror story about the effect that this evil house has on a young woman and how it changes her. Really interesting story. I've read this a few times now. I was like a lot of people who read this story for the first time and came away thinking, geez, that wasn't as scary as I thought it was, or thought it would be. But as I've read it a time or two since, I've come to really appreciate what this story is really doing. And it's an insidious story. It's really good. You should read it. The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. Let's move on to another great writer who's probably underappreciated and not read enough today. This is Charles Beaumont and his collection from Penguin, Perchance to Dream, Selected Stories by Charles Beaumont. This is excellent. Now, Charles Beaumont wrote around the same time that Ray Bradbury and Richard Matheson wrote their stories. His work has some similarity to theirs. He also was a writer on The Twilight Zone. But his stuff is different. It's a little hard to describe exactly what make these stories stand out so much. Appropriate for a collection called Perchance to Dream, his work is kind of dreamlike. It's really weird, really creepy, really interesting horror stories and fantasy stories. Great writer. He's not read enough. I try to talk about him whenever I get a chance and to talk about this book whenever I get an opportunity. So here I am talking about this book again. It deserves to be in this starter kit. It's a great book. Moving on to another vampire book, but a vampire book that's different from Dracula. This is Interview with a Vampire by Anne Rice. Of course, we all know how popular and influential this book has been. There's even a new TV show that's just come out that I haven't seen yet. I heard it's all right. But the book is essential reading if you're interested in horror. This did something different with the vampire story, and it must have been really something when this came out in the 1970s. This must have been a hell of a book to read back then when it came out, because this takes you into the world of the vampires, and it draws you into that world in a way that hadn't been done before. It's been done an awful lot since this book came out. This had a huge effect on all the vampire fiction that was written afterwards. So this is really important, this book, Interview with a Vampire. And it's a tremendously entertaining read. So, Interview with a Vampire. Read this book. Moving on, we're moving on to the author you knew I would get to eventually, Stephen King, one of the most influential horror writers of all time. His influence on horror fiction today is incalculable. So, the book that I'm going to recommend from Stephen King might be a surprise. I'm going to recommend Night Shift, and I think this is where you should start with Stephen King, and that's why I'm putting it in this starter kit. I could have started with a novel. I could have started with The Shining, which would be another good place to start. But I kind of think if you've never read King before and you're interested in horror, I'm not sure how that would happen, but I guess it could. This is where I would start with Stephen King, is this collection of horror stories from the 1970s. I happen to think these are his best horror stories. I think this is one of his very best books, Night Shift. Solid collection of horror stories, really creepy stuff in this. This shows you some of the things that Stephen King can do really, really well. He's good at some stuff, Stephen King is, and all of that is on display, I think, in this collection of short stories. Dynamite collection of horror stories. Moving on to something a little bit different. Moving on to The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. This is kind of a unique book. This is a book that can show you the power and the primal nature of fairy tales and legends, and just how horrifying those kinds of stories can be. She takes these old stories, these old fairy tales, and gives them her own twist. These are her versions of these stories. And I think this book, besides being beautifully written and a really unique reading experience, this shows you how eternal this type of story is. There's something about this kind of story that just gets you. And this is a really wonderful book. Not all of this is horror. There's at least one story that's frankly kind of amusing. But there's a lot of horror in this book. There's some scary stuff in here. And so I thought it definitely deserved a place here in this starter kit. Now moving on to something else. This is just a tremendous collection of horror novellas. This is Dark Gods by T.E.D. Klein. This collection of stories is just so well crafted, so meticulously put together, and so insidiously creepy that I had to put it in here. T.E.D. Klein is kind of a legend in horror fiction because his work is of such high quality, and he's written so little of it. T.E.D. Klein was for a long time the editor of Twilight Zone magazine. But the fiction that he wrote, while the quantity of it is really small, the quality is really large. This is a really good writer of horror stories. And of the few books that he wrote, I think this is the best one. I think it's even better than his novel, The Ceremonies. I think Dark Gods is just a really effective collection of novellas. And it was for a long time tremendously hard to find this collection. It was tough to get, but it has been recently republished, so it's something that you can get easily. I've noticed even the prices of the older editions have gone down since the new edition has come out, and now you can actually get this book and read it. This book is excellent. You should read this book. Moving on, we're going to move on to the last book, and I saved this for last because this is an author that should be talked about more. He is talked about, but I think he should be talked about more, and that's Clive Barker, another author who I could have chosen many books, but I chose the Books of Blood, all 6 of them, although depending where you live and where they were published, in some places there are 3 books and the next 3 are titled differently, but there were 6 books of blood. I recommend all of them if you can get your hands on them. Read these books. At one time, Clive Barker was called The Future of Horror by Stephen King, long ago. And I think that's kind of proven to be the case because his work was so influential that it affected everything in horror that came after, practically. He was tremendously influential and important in the 1980s, but he's done a lot of great work since then. I do think The Books of Blood is the place to start with Clive Barker, though. He has a lot of different kinds of fiction that he's written. He's written fantasy stuff. He's written all kinds of stuff, but his horror stuff, creepy, disturbing, ghastly. In The Books of Blood, man, you need to read these books. Again, essential horror, as all of these books are, and I hope you check them all out if you are a horror fan. So there you go. That is my horror starter kit, and I will catch you next time.